A parent's love for their child is supposed to be unconditional. But what happens when that love turns into unimaginable horror? This is the story of Christopher Francisquini, a father who committed an unthinkable crime. His 11-month-old daughter, Camilla, should have been safe in his arms, but instead, she became the victim of one of the most gruesome murders in recent history. Why would a father do this? What led to this horrifying act? Stay with us as we uncover the disturbing details of this case. At first glance, Christopher Francisquini seemed like an ordinary man. To the outside world, he was just another father living in Naugatuck, Connecticut. No one could have imagined the horrifying crime he would commit, especially not against his own daughter. Camilla Francisquini was only 11 months old, a child so innocent, so fragile. She had just begun to take her first steps, to smile at the world with pure joy. But her life was cut short in the most gruesome way possible. On November 18th, 2022, police received a call that led them to a crime scene they would never forget. Inside the family home, they discovered something truly horrifying. Camilla was dead, not just murdered, but brutally attacked, her tiny body dismembered. The details were so disturbing that even experienced officers struggled to process the scene. Who could do something so evil? The answer was even more shocking: her own father. But why? What could push a man to commit such a horrific act against his own flesh and blood? As investigators searched for answers, one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of a case that would haunt everyone who heard about it. Christopher Francisquini wasn't a stranger to violence. His past was filled with red flags, criminal records, aggressive behavior, and mental health struggles. But no one thought he was capable of something this monstrous. Investigators quickly uncovered that Francisquini had a history of legal troubles. He had been arrested multiple times for violent crimes, including assault. He was even out on parole when the murder happened. But despite his troubled past, no one imagined he would harm his own child. The night before the crime, neighbors reported hearing loud noises from the house. But in a quiet suburban neighborhood, no one thought much of it. They assumed it was just another domestic argument. What they didn't know was that inside that house, a nightmare was unfolding. Sometime during that fateful night, Francisquini attacked his own daughter. The details of what he did to Camilla were beyond horrifying. Police reports describe a scene so brutal that even the most experienced officers were left shaken. After the crime, Francisquini didn't wait around. He fled the scene, leaving behind the unimaginable. But the question remained: where is he now? The morning of November 18th, 2022, started like any other in the quiet town of Naugatuck, Connecticut. But for the officers who arrived at Christopher Francisquini's home that day, it was a scene they would never forget. Inside the house, everything seemed eerily normal at first, until they stepped into the room where 11-month-old Camilla had been. What they saw was beyond comprehension. Camilla's body had been brutally dismembered, her remains left in a way that suggested unimaginable rage. The crime was not just a murder. It was an act of sheer brutality. Veteran detectives, who had seen the worst of humanity, struggled to process what lay before them. The crime scene was so horrific that some officers had to step outside to regain their composure. They had dealt with homicides before, but this was something else. As forensic teams moved in, it became clear that this was not a random act of violence. This was personal. Someone in that house had unleashed pure evil, and all signs pointed to one person: Christopher Francisquini. But there was one major problem. He was nowhere to be found. The hunt for a child killer had begun. As soon as police realized Christopher Francisquini was missing, an urgent statewide manhunt was launched. His name and face flooded the news, warning the public that a dangerous man was on the loose. Authorities believed Francisquini fled immediately after the crime. His car was found abandoned on Interstate 91 in New Haven, Connecticut, just a few hours after Camilla's body was discovered. Had he planned his escape in advance? Or was he running out of sheer panic? The FBI, state police, and local authorities joined forces to track him down. Tips started pouring in, but none led to his immediate capture. Citizens were warned not to approach him. He was considered extremely violent and unpredictable. For 2 weeks, Francisquini evaded capture. People in the community were terrified, knowing that a brutal child killer was roaming free. The police searched abandoned buildings, monitored security cameras, and followed every possible lead. Then a breakthrough came. A tip led authorities to a bus station in Waterbury, Connecticut. Was this finally the end of the chase? On December 2nd, 2022, 2 weeks after Camilla's murder, police finally caught up with Christopher Francisquini. A sharp-eyed citizen recognized him at a bus station in Waterbury and immediately alerted authorities. Police moved in swiftly. Francisquini didn't resist. He was taken into custody without a struggle, almost as if he knew his time was up. The community breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that a dangerous man was no longer free. At the police station, officers interrogated him, but Francisquini remained silent about his motive. Why had he done it? What had driven him to kill his own daughter in such a brutal way? One thing was certain: he was facing a lifetime behind bars. He was charged with murder with special circumstances, meaning he could receive life in prison without parole. But for many, the question still lingered. Why? What led a father to commit such a horrifying crime? The answers remained buried deep within the mind of a killer. With Christopher Francisquini behind bars, investigators focused on building an airtight case against him. The forensic team had already uncovered gruesome details from the crime scene, but now they needed undeniable proof to ensure he would never walk free again. Inside the house, blood evidence was found in multiple rooms, suggesting that the crime wasn't impulsive. It was drawn out. Camilla had suffered multiple forms of trauma, including strangulation and stab wounds, before being dismembered. The sheer brutality of the attack suggested uncontrolled rage or deep psychological issues. In addition, police recovered security footage from a nearby location that captured Francisquini disposing of evidence shortly after the murder. His DNA and fingerprints were found on the discarded items, sealing his fate. Forensic psychiatrists were brought in to analyze his mental state, but even they struggled to understand what could push a father to commit such an inhumane act. The public wanted answers, but none seemed to come. As the evidence stacked against him, there was no doubt Christopher Francisquini was going away for life. But one final mystery remained. What was his motive? Psychologists and legal experts debated the biggest question: why did Christopher Francisquini kill his own daughter? Some believed it was a result of severe mental illness, possibly psychosis or a personality disorder. Others argued that it was an act of pure rage, triggered by something unknown. His criminal history showed violent tendencies, but never to this extent. Francisquini had a record of domestic violence and assault, but no one close to him had predicted that he could kill his own child. Reports suggested that he had stopped taking his prescribed medication and had exhibited unstable behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. In court, Francisquini remained expressionless. He refused to explain his actions, refused to apologize, and showed no remorse. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded monster, while his defense team suggested severe mental instability. But whether it was madness or malice, the end result was the same. A helpless child was taken in the most horrifying way imaginable. And now, all that remained was to decide his punishment. The trial of Christopher Francisquini became one of the most highly anticipated court cases in Connecticut. People wanted justice for Camilla, and the prosecution was determined to ensure that Francisquini would never be free again. During the trial, the prosecution laid out the horrific details of the crime. They presented DNA evidence, security footage, and witness testimonies that left no doubt. Francisquini had brutally murdered his own daughter. The courtroom was silent as jurors were shown images of the crime scene. Some people even broke down in tears. His defense team argued that he suffered from severe mental illness and that he was not in his right mind when the crime occurred. They claimed he had a history of paranoid delusions and had stopped taking his medication, which may have led to the violent outburst. But was that enough to save him from the harshest possible sentence? The jury had a difficult decision ahead. As closing arguments began, one question remained. Would he be sentenced to death, life in prison, or something else? After weeks of testimony, the jury finally reached a verdict. The entire courtroom held its breath as the judge prepared to announce the fate of Christopher Francisquini, guilty of murder with special circumstances. The words echoed through the room. He showed no emotion, no regret, just an empty stare. But for Camilla's family, this was a moment of justice. Since the crime was considered especially heinous, the prosecution pushed for life in prison without parole, the harshest possible sentence. Some even argued that he deserved the death penalty, but Connecticut had abolished it years earlier. The judge agreed with the prosecution, calling the crime one of the most disturbing cases he had ever seen. He sentenced Francisquini to life in prison without the possibility of release. With Christopher Francisquini sentenced to life in prison without parole, the case was officially closed. But for many, the pain remained. Camilla Francisquini would have been celebrating her second birthday the following year. Instead, her name became a tragic reminder of how cruel the world can be. Her mother and loved ones were left with nothing but memories, while the man responsible for her death would spend the rest of his days behind bars. Though justice had been served, the question still lingered. Could this have been prevented? Many argued that the system had failed. Francisquini had a history of violence and mental instability, yet he was still out on the streets. Should there be stricter monitoring for those with violent pasts? Could this tragedy have been avoided if someone had intervened earlier? As society reflects on this horrifying case, one truth remains: an innocent life was lost, and no sentence can bring her back. Camilla's story serves as a chilling reminder of how unpredictable evil can be, even when it comes from the people who are supposed to love us the most. Camilla's tragic death raises important questions about child protection, mental health awareness, and domestic violence prevention. If you or someone you know is struggling with violent tendencies or mental illness, don't wait. Speak up before it's too late. Organizations around the world work tirelessly to protect children from abuse and help people with severe mental health struggles get the treatment they need. But they can't do it alone. If you ever suspect a child is in danger, report it to the authorities. If you or someone close to you is experiencing violent thoughts, seek professional help. Prevention starts with awareness. Together, we can help ensure that no child suffers the way Camilla did.